Hi, I'm Will Randall, and today I'll be discussing mobile experience sampling methods in music research. I'll begin by identifying some of the issues of traditional methods and then move on to the history of ESM as it's being used in music psychology. Finally, I'll cover the range of variables involved in the experience sampling of music listening in relation to my own ESM app, MuPsych. I'll start with something that shouldn't shock anyone. The field of music psychology and psychology at large relies heavily on a very limited set of methodologies. The vast majority of psychological research utilizes surveys, laboratory experiments, or qualitative interviews. A systematized review of research methods used in psychological research performed in 2020 supports this claim. Of 551 research papers from the field of social psychology, around 2/3 utilized surveys or questionnaires, while 12% used experimental tasks, and a further 12% involved interviews or qualitative methods. This adds up to over 90% of research in this field directly relying on one of these three main approaches. Anecdotally, it seems that during the COVID pandemic, every research psychologist on Earth fell back to using the online survey method. However, when it comes to everyday music listening, these traditional methods bring their own inherent issues, including two major problems that I will cover now. The first of these problems is that of recall bias. Anytime a participant is asked to recall something, their response could reflect a reconstructive memory of unique or personally relevant events. These memories may be altered by commonly held beliefs of situational appropriateness or experimenter demand. They may also be influenced by their current mood, with poor correlation with actual behaviors. This generally results in an underreporting of mood fluctuations and cognitive strategies, and an overreporting of behavioral strategies, which is obviously an issue when trying to study everyday music listening. The second problem is that of ecological validity, with ecology being how organisms exist in their environment, and validity, of course, how well a test measures what it is supposed to measure. Experiments and surveys often neglect the social context of music and emotion, and don't consider the situational functions of music. Furthermore, experiments often control the choice and autonomy of the listener. So, looking back at our three main approaches, generally speaking, experiments suffer from low ecological validity, while surveys and interviews involve recall biases. For everyday music listening and the associated outcomes, these methods may consider the music and the listener, but often neglect the context of music listening. A solution to these two problems comes through the experience sampling method, or ESM, developed by Csikszentmihalyi in 1989. ESM presents brief questionnaires relating to current subjective experience throughout everyday functioning. This has been shown to be a robust method for examining the subjective experience of individuals during genuine, evolving musical episodes in everyday life. ESM has been used several times in the field of music psychology, with some notable examples listed here. In 1995, Thompson and Larson used pages to alert 483 participants 49 times over a week, investigating the influence of social context and music type on mood. John Sloboda and his Kiel team also used pages for a week to study the context and functions of musical experiences. In 2004, North et al. Harnessed text message technology to send alerts over a 2-week period, looking at the who, what, when, where, and why of everyday music listening. Palmtop Computers made an appearance for the excellent study by Patrick Uslin and his team in Uppsala, with 98 reports over 2 weeks, investigating emotional reactions by listener, music, and situation. In 2011, Greasley and Lamont texted participants 5 times a day for a week to study musical engagement in everyday life. And finally, Amanda Krauss published a series of great papers on an ESM using text messages over a 2-week period, focusing on devices and choice in everyday listening. While ESM does address the problems of recall bias and lack of ecological validity, these studies introduce some problems of their own. All used randomly timed sampling, which allowed for recall of previous music experiences, over several hours or an entire day, plus response times, which were often over an hour. Random sampling can't capture temporally sensitive variables such as how emotional states change over a listening episode. All studies were analysed on the listener level with aggregated experience variables, which somewhat defeats the purpose of and the contextual advantage of the ESM. Half of these studies required participants to carry an unfamiliar device, either a pager or palm top, which is intrusive to everyday functioning. And most of them required participants to carry self-report forms with them at all time. Research utilizing photosensor technology has shown that these paper forms are often either back-filled or forward-filled, and there's no real accurate way to assess exactly when they were filled out. Finally, these studies were all very difficult to run, and famously no researcher on this list has ever returned to set up and run their own ESM study. We also have to consider that the way in which people are listening to music has been constantly changing. In the age of the internet and smartphones, everyday music listening has become a more portable, accessible, and personalized experience. In 2019, 27% of all music listening worldwide happened on a smartphone, and this was up to 44% for that younger age group of 16 to 24-year-olds. As this is such a personal style of listening with the potential to strongly impact emotions and other states, it's important to understand how it influences people in their everyday lives. To do this, we developed a mobile ESM app named NEMuR. The original NEMuR used event-based sampling of music listening experiences with questions presented at the exact moment of listening, which means that we reduced recall bias. Participants didn't have to carry any foreign devices or self-report forms with them, and the app allowed them to listen to their own music collection, which means that listener choice and autonomy were maintained. Nikki Ricard and I used the original NEMuR to develop an overall model of music listening on mobile phones. The model included around 4,000 listening experiences, nested within 195 participants. We found that music generally returns listener affect to a neutral state, but that this was slowed by the selection of mood-congruent music. Also, certain conditions we found put listeners at risk of potential emotional harm. Finally, we found that around 95% of emotional outcomes were determined within situations rather than on the listener level. This provides strong support for the use of context-sensitive methods like the ESM. Here's the overall model of music listening on mobile phones from that original paper. Since that was published, I've simplified this diagram, which I'll get to soon. And here's how the effective state of the listener changed over the listening experience, from 3 levels of initial valence on the left and 3 levels of arousal on the right. The lines from each point represent different levels of valence or arousal perceived in the music, so this basically shows that more positively valenced music had a greater impact on those listeners who were initially in a negative state. I also need to mention a brilliant series of studies published more recently by Fabian Greb for his PhD thesis. Fabian also used multi-level modeling with listening experiences nested within listeners, although he used a random sampling approach of 14 alerts per day, as opposed to our event-based sampling of only 2 listening episodes per day. He found that situational variables predicted selected music far more than individual variables, which was exactly in line with our results. He also found that functions of music listening were a mediator between situational variables and music selection. And here is Fabian's model diagram, which is far neater than my original one, and ends with music selection rather than looking at the emotional outcomes of the listening experience. In NeuVascular, we developed a new and improved version of NEMuR, which has been updated to reflect recent findings in music science and also the changing ways people listen to their music. As with the original version, it employs an event-based sampling of music listening experiences with the guiding focus to minimize recall biases and maintain ecological validity. A major new addition is the integration with music streaming services, meaning that listeners can play music in an app such as Spotify and immediately receive questions from MuSight. MuSight collects data in two main ways. Firstly, music experience sampling reports, or ESRs, are presented whenever music is played on the phone. If music is still playing after a specified period, usually 5 or 10 minutes, a second set of questions is presented. There are also surveys presented within the app, which include basic demographic details and a battery of psychological surveys. This data collection period usually continues for 1 or 2 weeks. The complete picture of how everyday music listening on mobile phones influences listeners involves a complex interaction of many variables. Here we can see the MuSight model of emotional outcomes from music listening, which gives an overview of these interactions. The MuSight app collects data from all of these separate modules, which I will briefly cover now. The first component is listener variables. These include basic demographic details and a battery of psychological surveys that I mentioned. These surveys are presented within the app and measure individual traits such as personality, mental health indicators, and well-being. Next, we have the initial mood of the listener and how they regulate this mood with music. At the moment music starts playing, listeners report their valence and arousal, so how negative to positive they feel, and their energy levels. They then select a discrete mood state that describes how they feel, with a list of options reduced from 30 to around 10, based on their given valence and arousal levels. For example, if reported valence is negative and energy is high, the list of presented states will include angry and stressed. Following this, they rate the intensity of their selected mood state. We ask how they want to change these three measures, valence, arousal, and intensity, through their music listening. We then measure the same three measures again at 5 minutes to see how they have changed and how successful the listeners were in reaching their emotional goals. Listeners report their music listening context, with screens here for who is listening, where they are, and what they are doing while listening. For example, people may be listening alone or with friends, and they may be listening while walking or doing housework. All three of these first modules influence and predict the reason that someone has for listening. We ask the listeners their main reason for listening from within 8 main reason categories. These categories include listening for their current mood state or for their current activity. On a second screen, they select a specific reason for listening from a total of 55 reasons. For example, listening to maintain a happy mood or for background to studying. For emotional reasons, we also ask which emotion regulation strategy the listener used to reach their goal. This includes distracting from their problems or focusing on their feelings. So reasons for listening and all previous modules influence the way which music is selected. Listeners rate their perceived valence and arousal of the music, along with familiarity, enjoyment, and their attention level. The app also collects the song details from the phone, so we can analyze more objective music features to supplement this self-report data. This is done by extracting music features through music information retrieval. So there we have all of the variables collected by the MuSight app, which all interact to produce the emotional outcomes of music listening. This model is the basis for all MuSight research, which has been used in several projects based at the University of Uvascular. I'll briefly mention one ongoing project of ours, which aims to develop a scientific music recommender from the MuSight data. So all self-report data collected by the app will be combined with the more objective music feature data as extracted through music information retrieval. This combined set of data will be used in a machine learning model that will recommend music to individual listeners given their current listening context, initial mood state, and specific listening goals. This recommender will be an expert system guided by a set of directives we have developed from the music therapy and music and health literature. When completed, this will result in a hyper-personalized and scientifically accurate recommender that takes into account and supports mental and emotional health. I'll finish by mentioning another feature of the new version of MuSight, which is the ability to create customized studies for other music researchers. This is done by taking the standard MuSight study and modifying or adding ESR items and surveys. Researchers can also adjust variables such as the time between ESRs and the overall study period. This is available for all music researchers, so if any of you are interested, please see the details on the Music website. I believe that the true strength of the experience sampling method in music research will be its use in many different ways within the field, and in combination with complementary traditional methods to provide a comprehensive picture of how people listen to music. So on that note, I'll end my presentation for today, and thank you all very much for your time.